Hi everyone, my name is Emily LeClair and I'm a freshman here on the University of Louisville swimming and diving team. The topic we'll be discussing today is communication, and who better to talk to than Dr. Vanessa Shannon. Dr. Shannon is the Director of Mental Performance here at Louisville, and she has been closely working with our swimming and diving program. She is certainly an expert in her field, and I'm lucky to be getting to interview her today. Welcome, Dr. Shannon.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate that.
To get started, please tell us why you started working in the field of sports psychology.
Good question. Well, I jokingly tell people that the reason I started is because I was a collegiate athlete and I was not very good with my mental game, and I used to beat myself up a lot. So I jokingly say that I couldn't help myself, so I wanted to help other people. But ultimately, it was because I had kind of a passion for helping others and a passion for sport, and what better way to blend those two things. So I got lucky, and there happens to be a job that I can enjoy both of those passions with.
That's really cool, and I bet communication has been a big factor in what you do today.
Absolutely. It's a big factor in a number of different ways. Obviously, my communication with athletes and coaches is a big component of the work that I do on a daily basis. So I work with individual athletes each week. I have meetings with coaches, with staff. I also do team sessions, as you know. And so my ability to communicate what I'm trying to help the athletes and coaches understand is important. However, the other aspect of communication that becomes really important in what I do is teammate to teammate communication, and as well coach athlete communication. So that plays a big factor in what I do.
Cool. In our book, we learned about the different types of communication. There is self-talk, interpersonal versus interpersonal communication, active listening, communication blocks, and sandwich approach. With athletics, more specifically swimming and diving, where do you think these aspects fit into?
The biggest pieces of communication I would say that play into swimming and diving are the self-talk piece. I'm going to look there at your list too. Interpersonal communication obviously can play a piece in terms of coaches communicating, providing feedback. Active listening is important in that regard, because in order for you all as athletes to actually consume the information being provided by your coaches, you have to be able to listen. But for me, in terms of swimming and diving, I would say the biggest thing is the self-talk piece of it. So this idea that we have thoughts or talk in our head, this inner dialogue that can actually have a pretty significant influence on the way that we feel, and then ultimately the way that we perform. So a lot of the work that I do with our swimmers and divers here is related to what are you thinking about, what are you saying to yourself. And interestingly enough, that's probably changed over the course of my career in terms of what we want athletes to be thinking about. So previously, we probably wanted them to be thinking only positive, ever positive, and more we're starting to realize that it can't just be positive, it has to be realistic. So if I'm nervous, it's okay for me to say to myself, I'm nervous, but that's okay, and then keep kind of moving forward in my thoughts, rather than I have a lot of athletes who will get nervous, be terrified that they're nervous because they don't think they should be nervous. They think being nervous is a bad thing. And then they'll start kind of panicking in their own mind, and their self-talk will go very negative.
How do you think cue words fit into self-talk?
I think cue words are really important. I think it's the biggest thing with cue words is they have to resonate with you. They have to connect with you. So we want our words to be sticky. We want them to be things that we can kind of create habits with, and continually kind of in this automated way just have these conversations with ourselves prior to performance, hopefully as little as possible during performance, but that really depends on the sport. So having cue words, cue phrases, focus cues, a reset cue, an emergency cue, I think all of those things can be really useful.
Okay. I know self-talk has played a huge factor in how I perform,
Mm-hmm.
but the book also discusses interpersonal versus interpersonal communication. How do you see this in athletes?
Intrapersonal versus interpersonal communication?
Yeah.
How do I see that play out in athletics?
Mm-hmm.
It's really dependent on the sport, the way in which that works, right? Because there's, like I said, in swimming and diving, there's a limited amount of interpersonal communication.
Mm-hmm.
Because although if you're on a relay, you may need to talk about a race plan with your relay team, but the predominance of the interpersonal communication that occurs in swimming and diving is that coach-athlete communication. So swimming and diving we would call an individual sport, which, you all actually compete on a team. So it's better instead to say, I'm going to have a blank right now of what I want to say, but that's okay. I'll take my time. It's not necessarily at the collegiate level an individual sport as much as it is I'm forgetting the term that I want to use. But anyway, the point is, it's you. For the most part, you're alone on an island. You're kind of there competing with yourself. Whereas you have a sport like lacrosse or field hockey or football, and that's what we would call a co-acting sport, where these individuals are kind of interacting with one another and having to, my performance is then dependent on another person to a certain extent. So I think interpersonal communication in those sports becomes extremely important. And a team's ability to communicate effectively can obviously either improve their performance and enhance their performance or kind of deter it.
And you mentioned like the coach's relationship with the athlete. How do you think like coach's behavior can affect like athletes' communication with them?
Yeah, I would say that one of the biggest things that I see, one of the common things that I see with respect to first year athletes, and I say first year because sometimes they're transferring, sometimes they're freshmen, is kind of that the way the coach coaches and the way the athlete is used to be coaching, and the influence of how communication can kind of sort through that. So what I mean is, a lot of times Division I athletics is an interesting environment, right? Because our coaches here, their job is ultimately to win. Like, as much as all of them enjoy the process of helping develop student athletes and human beings and individuals and seeing them grow over the course of time, their job ultimately is to win and be successful, whatever, Tom and they kind of decide that means in terms of their sport. Because of that, it becomes very imperative for them. They have a limited amount of time with you all, so it becomes imperative for them to try and improve performance in that period of time. What tends to happen then, as I'm sure you've sort of noticed, is you don't get a ton of positive feel-good feedback anymore. You more so get, good job, you did the job well, or you get a lot of kind of constructive feedback, which can feel really critical to a lot of athletes who've transitioned here, especially if you come from a youth sports setting or a junior sports setting where your coach was really positive and feel good with kind of their feedback. So I think that can be difficult, and what I have to do is I have to sort of help coaches as much as they can be a little bit better about their delivery, but more importantly, I help our athletes try and kind of consume it correctly, right? So we'll talk with a lot of athletes, I'll talk to them about, and this is kind of a common sports psychology analogy, but you sort of have to take information from the coaches and strain it almost like you strain spaghetti in water, right? Like the water goes through and you keep the spaghetti. So if coach is providing feedback or communicating in a way that you're not used to, can you still get the message that's important and then potentially kind of leave the tone or whatever it might be that you're not used to?
Okay. Do you think, like, in our book we also learned about, like, a sandwich approach? Do you think, like, that would be a more effective way for coaches to deliver their message in order?
Yeah, I think, the thing about communication that I probably should have said at the beginning is it's very individualistic. It's kind of your preference, right? What you prefer, what you're used to, what you're comfortable with. The concern or the challenge, I guess I should say, at this level is, for example, your coach, how many athletes are on your team? Over 60 plus, right? So can he actually deliver 60 different styles of communication to 60 athletes? Probably not, right? Yeah. So here again, we're going to have to adjust the athlete's reception to the coach's style of communicating. But in terms of Oreoing or sandwiching, as we would say, I think it can be effective. I think the key with sandwiching is making sure that the person actually, the problem with sandwiching, I guess I should say, is we usually remember the thing we heard last. And so if you aren't very purposeful with giving the constructive piece and making sure they really hear it and learn from it, then it can be sandwiched away. It can be kind of overshadowed by the other piece of bread, if you will, right? Because if I say, good job, I need you to work on your right arm, but keep going. If all you hear is keep going and you don't hear I need you to work on your right arm, then are you actually going to change that? Right. So in that vein, I think it's really useful if you want to get someone's attention and open their ears to constructive feedback to start with the positive, because then that makes them more receptive to the feedback. Then give the constructive, make sure they're really processing that, and then on the back end of that just say, but like, I don't want you to take this as the only thing. We talked about the positive, now here's where we need to kind of learn and move forward. There's a process that we'll go through with athletes in sports psychology where we talk about well, better, how. What did we do well? What can we do better? And how can we do it better?
Okay.
And so oftentimes that's a nice way to sandwich it, because it's a positive of what did we do well. It's a what can we do better? There's the constructive. And then it's how can we do it better, which is on a positive note. Like, it's exciting because you're excited, you can get better. But it's not like this fluffy positive that kind of makes you forget the constructive.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Shannon. I know I really appreciate it, and I'm sure my class does too.
Absolutely, anytime.